Shabbat Shalom. As I mentioned in my share this week, the Ramban on the first part of Lech is harshly critical of Abraham. Let me quote you the Ramban verbatim. This is what he says. You should know that Avraham Avinu committed a great transgression by bringing his righteous wife Sarah to the stumbling block of sin because he feared for his life. He should have trusted that God would save him and his wife and all his belongings, for God surely has the power to help and to save. His leaving the land of Canaan because of the famine was also a sin he committed. It was because of this that the exile in the land of Egypt at the hand of Pharaoh was decreed for his descendants. Did you hear that? Did you listen carefully? According to the Ramban, Abraham should have stayed in Canaan and had faith in God that he would sustain him despite the famine. Not only was Abraham wrong to leave, he also put Sarah in a morally hazardous position, because as a result of going to Egypt, she was forced to tell a lie, that she was Abraham's sister, not his wife, and also she was taken into Pharaoh's harem, where she might have been forced to commit an act of adultery. To say the least, this is a very harsh judgment of Abraham, made worse by the Ramban's further assertion that it was as a result of this lack of faith that Abraham's descendants were sentenced to exile and slavery in Egypt centuries later. Later on in the Parshat, the Ramban criticizes Sarah as well. Despairing of having a child, Sarah asked Abraham to take her maid Hagar as a concubine wife, in the hope that she might bear him a child. Abraham did so, and Hagar became pregnant. The text then says that Hagar began to despise her mistress. Sarah complained to Abraham and then afflicted Hagar, who subsequently, no doubt as a result of Sarah's hostility, fled from her into the desert. The Ramban writes about this as follows. Our mother Sarah transgressed by afflicting Hagar, as did Abraham by allowing her to do so. And so God heard Hagar's affliction and gave her a son who would be a wild ass of a man to afflict the seed of Abraham and Sarah with all kinds of affliction. Truthfully, in this situation, the moralizing is a bit easier to understand. Sarah's conduct does seem to be quite volatile and harsh. The Torah itself says that Sarah afflicted Hagar, yet Ramban seems to be saying that it was this episode in the ancient past that explains Jewish suffering at the hands of Ishmael in a much later age, even today. Let's be honest. It's not that difficult to defend Abraham and Sarah in these incidents, and other commentators do mitigate their actions. Abraham couldn't be sure that God would perform a miracle and save him and Sarah from the famine had they stayed in Canaan, nor was he to know that Egyptians would endanger his life and place Sarah in a moral dilemma. Neither of them had ever been to Egypt before. And Sarah and Hagar? Although an angel sent Hagar back later when Ishmael and Isaac were born, Sarah once again banished Hagar. Abraham protested, and on that occasion God told him to do what Sarah had said. So the Ramban's criticisms are easily answered. If so, why did he make them? Ramban surely did not make these comments lightly. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks writes that the Ramban was driven by another consideration altogether, namely, he was trying to understand the justice or seeming injustice of history. Why did the Jews suffer exile and slavery in Egypt? Why, in the Ramban's day and since, were Jews subject to attacks by radical Islamists? The Ramban believes, as we say in our prayers, "U'mipnei chata'enu galinu me'aretzenu," because of our sins we were exiled from our land. What sins did the Jews commit in the days of Jacob that merited exile? None that jump out at you. The Ramban also believes that Maaseh Avot Siman Lebanim, the acts of the fathers are a sign for the children, and that what happened in the lives of the patriarchs foreshadowed what would happen to their descendants. What had they done to Ishmael to earn the scorn of his descendants? For the Ramban, the answer can be found in Sarah's treatment of Hagar. This approach is also problematic, though. The Torah states quite explicitly in the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, that God may punish the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation, but not beyond. The rabbis further restricted this to cases where the children continue in the sins of their parents. What is very interesting about Ramban's approach to Abraham and Sarah is his willingness to point out the flaws in their behavior. This idea answers a fundamental question about our understanding of the narratives in Genesis. How should we judge the patriarchs when their behavior seems problematic? Here's some examples. Jacob taking Esau's blessing in disguise, or Shimon and Levi's brutality killing all the inhabitants of Shechem while rescuing their sister Dinah. The stories in Bereshit are often morally perplexing. The Torah rarely pronounces judgment on the conduct of any of the protagonists. This means that it is sometimes difficult to teach these narratives as a guide to how we should behave. As a result of this void, the rabbis later offered a systematic reinterpretation in the Midrash so that black and white could take the place of subtle shades of grey. Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Chayes, who was a 19th century scholar in Poland, explains that the tendency of Midrash to take the heroes in the Tanakh, make them seem perfect, and the villains completely evil, is all for educational reasons. The word Torah means teaching or instruction. It is difficult to teach ethics through stories whose characters are fraught with complexity and ambiguity. So why does the Torah paint its characters in shades of grey? Rabbi Sachs suggests 3 reasons. The first is that the moral life is not something we understand in depth all at once. As children, we hear stories of heroes and villains. We learn basic distinctions, right and wrong, good and bad, permitted and forbidden. As we grow older, however, we begin to realize how difficult some decisions are. Do I go to Egypt? Do I stay in Canaan? Do I show compassion to my servant's child at the risk that he may be a bad influence on my own child? Or don't I? If you think that such decisions are easy, then you know nothing about life. The best way of teaching ethics is to do it by way of stories that can be read differently at different times in our lives. Secondly, not only are decisions difficult, people are complex. No one in the Torah is portrayed as perfect. Noach, the only person in Tanakh to be called righteous, ends up drunk and disorderly. Moshe, Aaron and Miriam are all punished for their sins. So is King David. King Solomon, the wisest of men, ends his deeply compromised life, as a result of his countless wives and power plays. So many of the prophets suffer dark nights of despair. There is none so righteous on earth, says Kohelet, as to do only good and never sin. No religious literature was ever further from hagiography, idealization, and hero worship than the Hebrew scriptures. It is amazing. Even the non-heroes have their saving graces. Esav is a loving son. Levi, condemned by Jacob for his violence, counts Moses, Aaron, and Miriam among his grandchildren. Even Pharaoh, the man who enslaved the Jews, had a moral heroine for a daughter. The Talmud tells us that the descendants of Korach sang psalms in the Temple of Solomon. This is a demonstration of moral maturity, so different from the dualism adopted by many other religions. Lastly, more than any other religious literature, the Torah makes an absolute distinction between earth and heaven, God and human beings. Because God is who he is, there is space for humans to be human. In Judaism, the line dividing them is never blurred. Our heroes are never gods, or even close to gods. They are God's representatives. That's it! Only God is God. That is a very rare religious theology. And as a result, no religion in history has ever held a higher view of humanity than Judaism. The Torah tells us we are all created in the image and likeness of God. Still, no religion has been more honest about the failings of even the greatest among humans. That's because God does not ask us to be perfect. We are not God. He is perfect. God merely asks us to take the risks in pursuit of what is right and what is good, and to acknowledge the mistakes that we all will inevitably make. Abraham and Sarah were not perfect, but that's okay, because God is perfect, and it is to him that we look for our hope, our salvation, our destiny, and our spiritual zenith. Shabbat Shalom.